We have Maggie Merklin, who is the Chief Client Officer at Analytics Partners. We have Dow Bergsma, who's the Chief Marketing Officer at Piedmont Health. And we have Shiv Misra, who is the Head of Consumer Engagement and Retention, Digital and Print for Gannett. So take it away to our great panel.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming, especially right after lunch. I am very confident that the three of us will keep you entertained for the next hour or so. Hopefully you guys all have the Analytic Partners swag on your chairs. There's a towel in there. So as we were talking earlier, let's not sweat the uncertainty, right? We have those towels to keep us all nice and cool. So I'll kick it off. I'm Maggie Merklin, as Jason mentioned, Chief Client Officer with Analytic Partners. Going to talk a little bit today around what we're seeing in the marketplace around planning during uncertainty, and hear from Dow and Shiv with their perspective, and really keeping this conversational for you folks. And hopefully you'll take away some key learnings from all of us. As Jason mentioned, there's a lot of uncertainty right now. There's a lot of disruption. We've seen that over the last couple of years, of course, with the pandemic, which none of us knew what to do. It was something we hadn't really seen in the past. And with potentially a looming recession, that disruption and that uncertainty is likely going to continue. So I think many of you might have seen Nancy, our CEO's presentation earlier today, and she shared this slide, and it's something that we're hearing from the brands that we work with over and over again. Questions that come up during these types of times are really around what should I do if I have to cut my budget? There's a lot of pressure around understanding the impact of marketing investment. And really with that, it just makes the need for scenario planning that more important. So scenario planning, what is that? It's really around simply understanding the risks and opportunities going forward. So looking at different types of outcomes and really understanding, what those, potential scenarios might be, whether positive or potentially negative for a brand. And what we see as really core to scenario planning is to start with a framework. First, really understanding what those measurements of success are. So really aligning cross-functionally around what does success look like? Are we looking to grow our top line? Are we looking to have potential savings to the bottom line? And really getting everybody on board with what those measurements of success are. The second is really around understanding the performance drivers. So there's things that we can control, right? There's our marketing investment, but there's also things that are beyond our control. And that's really where that uncertainty comes into play. What's going to happen with the economy? What's going to happen with maybe competitors as well? So really having that holistic view from an analytics and measurement perspective is important when you think about that scenario planning as well. And then last but not least is taking into account key considerations. So every business is different. You might have a portfolio of brands. They're all going to be different in terms of the different outcomes and considerations that you really need to think about. So kind of understanding the unique dynamics of your business, your brand is key when we're thinking about scenario planning as well. So a couple of key things that we've seen, and some of these we shared actually earlier today in the main stage presentation as well. If we kind of hone in on those performance drivers, and like I said, there's those things that we can control and those things that we can't. We're going to talk a little bit about those things that we can control that are really foundational when we think about scenario planning. So if we think about the drivers of advertising effectiveness, there's 5 key things that we see in our 20 years of doing analytics and measurement across a number of different brands and industries. And the 2 most important ones are what we're going to hone in on today, which are the amount of investment, which is obviously critical, especially when we think about that pressure of marketing advertising budgets being cut, And then second is the quality of creative, which we can't lose sight of either. And then those other three, halo, mix of media, channel optimization, are also very important. And in the interest of time, we're going to focus on the other two. But if you have questions on those, we'd be happy to share more on those as well. So the amount of media investment. So what we typically see is that those brands that invest during uncertainty, during times of disruption, tend to see a stronger ROI, a 60% higher ROI than those types of those brands that did not invest during a recession. They also experience business growth, and they also tend to see continuous improvement in their return on investment as well. So investing in the brand is critical. It's something that was very interesting for us to see during the pandemic, where a lot of brands reacted very quickly. They cut their budgets. Where they could, they scaled back. And what we saw is that those brands that continue to invest perform better coming out of the pandemic as well. They were just stronger. They had that brand health versus those that completely scaled back their media investment. Consistent with that is understanding competition as well. So if you scale back and your competition continues to invest, that's going to obviously hurt your brand as well. And what we've seen in our ROI genome as well is that if a similar sized brand doubles their investment in marketing, we can see almost a 15% on average loss for our own brand sales. So monitoring that competition is also critical. Understanding share of voice is critical when we're thinking about how to invest, when to invest, and how much to invest. And creative is key. So when we look at video in particular, so TV advertising, online video, we typically see that 2/3 of the impact of that advertising is actually driven by the creative itself versus the executional elements. And that's important. You can't undervalue creative. It is really, really key to success. And when we're thinking about creative, brand messaging tends to be that type of creative that tends to perform best as well. So brand messaging outperforms on average 80% of the time other types of advertising messages. And so to really sum it up in terms of scenario planning and what that means for brands, some of the keys to success that we've seen is that we need to take that data-driven approach. We need to look holistically at what potentially drives our brand performance. From a industry or a cross-functional perspective, we need to make sure that we have all the key stakeholders at the table to be part of that alignment as well. We can't be looking just at marketing in a silo. We have to bring in our counterparts from finance as well as other parts of the organization. And the other key thing is that it's not stagnant. We need to continuously evolve and monitor and track and adapt when we're scenario planning as well. And with that, I will over to Ship, who will share some of his experiences as well.
Thank you so much, Maggie. So a little bit on me. So I work for Gannett, USA Today Network. I lead consumer retention for the business, and I've been doing data analytics for about 15 years in 7 different industries. So when we were talking about this topic, I was like, ambiguity is nothing new for analytics. Like the data folks know, how situations were and how they are, and they are always evolving. So what I've tried doing here is I only have one slide. And my objective is, and I have 5 T's right in the headline. If you remember 3 out of those 5 T's from the session, I am golden. So I would say, these 5 T's are essentially what make analytics a useful tool. Like what we do not want to happen is, in the time of ambiguity or in a dynamic that's happening right now, we don't want a fancy set of data people sitting in a room and doing some fancy work that is not actionable. We don't want that. We don't want that kind of investment. Like I was sharing with Dow and Maggie earlier, I worked very closely with CFOs, and CFOs do not want to make that investment. So what we need to make sure is analytics is transparent. There is trust, and I'll get to all of that in the examples below. There's timeliness, you cannot work on something forever. It needs to start and stop and be in front of decision makers tomorrow. I'm actually on the marketing side now, so I'm now working with the data people who are supporting me, and I'm constantly my patience is being tested. So I'm teaching them, guys, get it in front of us, even if it's not perfect. I need to have a stronger data-driven solution versus a gut-based approach. Test a lot. This is the time to test. So if you are planning to invest in test and learn, this is the time to test and learn. Do all kind of testing, do creative testing, try and see what is it that's working with your audience, because with everything going on, the consumer mindset is also changing. So it's not just their wallet or the size of the wallet. It's also their needs, their demands are changing. So try and keep a tab on that. And market research is amazing, but research takes a lot of time. So you need to test while you're researching and have something tangible. Analytics, as I said, cannot be a piece of white paper that people are like, oh my gosh, this reads so nice, and what do I do with it? So it has to be tangible. So I have three broad buckets, that kind of explain these 5 T's. First one, I'll repeat, time is of essence. So what we need to make sure is, I'll give a real example here. So there was this organization that I used to work with, and they were working on about 300 projects with a team of about 25 data people. And I was like, okay, that's pretty awesome, but how much are we delivering? And we were delivering 2 projects in a month. So imagine we have hundreds of projects sitting on the pipeline and not really coming out of it. So and I was like, okay, why is that happening? And they were like, okay, we are trying to make our model a little bit better, right? So data guys are always chasing perfection. So if you guys are on the data side, I would recommend try and empathize with your end user. If you are on the end user side, like a marketeer, try and explain to your data people that you are not seeking perfection. Now this example, I can share the name, is from PayPal. And my team there, I was like, okay, so why do we have the delay? They were like, model, we are trying to make it perfect. They were going to make it perfect for the finance people. And finance people, don't get me wrong, they want accurate numbers. They don't want to go to Wall Street and have a number and then the investor analyst sitting there challenges you there. Nobody wants that. They were doing the same for marketing. And marketing was not using any of the analysis. And because they were like, by the time my campaign is over and I'm already executing the new campaign, that's when your analysis comes in. So how do I use it? It's not actionable at all. So what we did was we created an 80% accurate dashboard for marketing, which was real time. So it was basically real-time campaign monitoring dashboard and optimization dashboard. You know what it did? PayPal had a lot of online campaigns. And sometimes the problem is not as big as, oh my God, my consumer needs are shifting. Sometimes the problem is the link is not working. So the traffic stops flowing. And all we have to do is go back and fix that link, right? And that's exactly what that dashboard did. So I would say, explain, to the data people. And if you're the data person, know that time is so important. Second one is learn before you scale. So you cannot start investing in tools and technologies that are going to help your business 10 years down the line. Your CFO will not appreciate it. As much as they say, innovate, but putting an investment in a time of ambiguity, it's the most uncomfortable thing for the C-level to digest. Unless, of course, you have a great explanation for it, that what Maggie said, you don't spend, somebody else eats your pie, and then you are like, oh my gosh, I have to spend so much more to bring my pie back. But I would say, test and learn. I would like to definitely emphasize on the power of A/B testing and the power of multivariate testing. So it does not have to be 15 data people doing this. You need to have a robust data management platform. You need to clearly know who your audience is. And it's a very big and ambiguous question in itself. But in the time of ambiguity, you need to kind of either know or hypothesize and then go and test that hypothesis. Unless you do that, unless you form an opinion and then validate that opinion, you would not get anywhere. Like, because I work with a lot of CMOs, or I worked with a lot of CMOs who would come to me and they're like, okay, Shiv, let's wait for the data to come back and tell me who my customers are. Let's wait for this research to finish. Okay, great. When will that research come to you? 6 months down the line. Oh my gosh. So what do we do for 6 months? We continue with BAU. And I'm like, oh my gosh, like forget about the pandemic. Like you cannot have that amount of waiting period running something that is not effective or efficient. So we actually started testing, and we were like, okay, if my audience does not like this, I'll show this. If they don't like this, I'll show them this. But that's how you start learning behavior of your audience. And while segmentation based on psychographics is great, try and segment your audience based on their behavior. And I would say that would be the best data investment that you can make as an organization. Last but never the least, making analytics transparent. So analytics, as I said, some people feel it's a black box. So please, if you're a data person, open the doors, make it a glass box, make everybody look into it. I had a fantastic experience working with Analytic Partners back at Heineken. And even though Analytic Partners was our vendor partner, they were so transparent. We loved it, right? Because that's when you know the nuts and bolts. That's when you know that, okay, I can trust this person. I did the same with my executive, leadership team. I went to the CEO at Heineken, and I actually explained the whole model to him. And he's like, Shiv, I'm an expert now. And I'm like, yes, that's the kind of confidence I'm looking for, because now you can trust what I'm doing. Unless you do that, they're like, okay, it's a bunch of people spending so much money and doing some scientific stuff. No, we don't want that to happen. We want them to know what is cooking, of course, at a 20,000 feet level. Second, it's also not a crystal ball. So don't assume that the data person will have all the answers. They actually would not. I emphasize testing. Sometimes, what the result of testing is? Inconclusive. That the test was perfect, everything went well, but nothing came out of it. And that's a totally acceptable answer, because it's a part of learning process. So I would say if you are the data person, make sure that people don't really feel that you have a crystal ball and you have all the answers. If you're not a data person, please know that data is science more than anything else. And there's a process to which you get data in and the answers out. So again, the bottom line is make analytics super transparent. So that is it, I would say. Questions towards the end, but I would love to pass it back to Dow.
Thank you. Thank you, Maggie. Thank you, Shiv. Thanks, everybody, for being here. Hopefully, I'll have some nuggets for you to add to what two of my partners here shared. But before I go there, who here is from the state of Georgia? One. Well, we don't all get to be that lucky to live in Georgia. So those two know, according to the data, what Piedmont is. The rest of you, I'll give you a brief overview. We are the largest healthcare system in Georgia. We have 22 hospitals, 1,400 locations, anything from urgent care, primary care physicians, all the way to heart transplants and stroke centers. We're a $6.5 billion non-for-profit organization, and we have about 33,000 employees. And as you can imagine, we cover about 80% of the state. And as you can imagine, we face a lot of uncertainty. Like all of you, we have the global and macro level uncertainty, like are we going to have, how big is inflation going to be, which influences what patients are willing to spend. The health industry is being disrupted. Most of you already know what it is if Amazon comes to your doorstep. They just bought 150 practices, so I'm competing with Amazon again. I thought I got away from that when I moved from Georgia Pacific to healthcare. We have the same challenges in Marcom. Obviously, the pandemic, while most of you were impacted by the pandemic, we had to impact the pandemic because we took care of 40,000 patients, and hopefully they, making sure as many survives as possible. And after the largest healthcare crisis in our history, which still is going on, we still have quite a few patients in our hospitals, we basically faced the largest talent crisis in our history because a lot of the folks worn out and basically said, I'm done being on the front line nonstop. And obviously we couldn't plan for that, but as the pandemic hit us, we were actually on a growth spurt. When I joined Piedmont 2.5 years ago, We were a $4 billion company with 11 hospitals. Today we're 6.5 with 22 hospitals, which was all right in the exact same period as the pandemic. So we were integrating and entering new regions. Why am I saying that? The combination of entering new markets, the pandemic, being disrupted, and on top of all the other trends that we see and all of the other uncertainty, it is important to have a strong brand. You know, when you face uncertainty, you want to have some certainty, and brands give that certainty and trust. Well, we looked at the data, and you can look across the board, but whether you look at the long-term measures or the short-term measures, other than NPS, all of our health metrics were not favorable. Now, I always joke about NPS. You just saved somebody's life, and then you ask them, would you recommend this doctor to a friend? Well, you know, of course our NPS is high, and my boss is always very proud of how high our NPS is. It's up in the 80s. But the good thing is we know, like, once you go through our system, the patients really love and prefer our system. The bad thing is that outside of the non-patients didn't, and you see those measures. We did everything that Analytic Partners tells you to do this morning and just now, so I don't have to repeat it, but we rebranded ourselves, we found our brand positioning, we launched a new campaign. We are literally in the middle of rebranding our brand identity. We did everything on this list. We invested more. Our creative quality went up. We have a halo effect. We increased our media mix and our channel optimization so much so I took a few slides out for just 5 minutes before the presentation because they already had the slides this morning and earlier on. That's how much aligned we were. And ta-da, it worked. 8 months into the campaign, our awareness is a record high, our favorability is a record high, conversion is a record high, activation, which is the adoption of digital tools like MyChart and online bookings, are record high. The NPS stayed high despite the influx of new patients. During COVID, we had so many more patients that we thought the NPS is going to take a hit, but it didn't. And the one thing that we need to do is loyalty. And loyalty for us means that if you get a flu shot with us, we also would like you to replace your shoulder with us. And what happens a lot is, you know, you do your sports check and your flu shot, but you go to Emory, our key competitor, to get a new shoulder or a new knee or, you know, your open heart transplant. And it sounds weird if you're not in healthcare. It's kind of weird. I used to work in toilet paper and potato chips. It was much easier. So I'm used to, like, if and when you need healthcare, we hope you choose us. Where with potato chips, they're like, no, you need to choose us. Even when you don't need it, impulse buy. What did we learn? 5 considerations on top of what you said. The biggest thing I would say is have a philosophy, have a framework, have an approach, have a DNA. I used to be with Procter for 19 years. They're a fantastic marketing school, and they had the who, what, how framework, and I probably can still repeat it top of mind. They might have adjusted it over the years, but I kind of probably can work there tomorrow and kind of know what they're doing. Georgia Pacific, we built one. We call it the brand of the heart framework. But at Piedmont, there was none. And Lily, what she said, hey, I used to work at AirTran. I used to work at Delta. I just came from UPS. I came from Home Depot. We have fantastic companies in Atlanta. But their marketing philosophy and approach is not the same. So the folks in one area of marketing were completely following a different marketing approach than others. So when I came in, it's like, we need a marketing philosophy. We need a DNA. You'll see a lot that you recognize from, you know, what Analytic Partners shared, what Warwick is sharing. It's a very simple model because in a days of uncertainty and in an area where you have so much data and information, you need a simplified for your organization. So when I sit down with my CEO, I literally had a board presentation last week and we took them through this. These are the simple things. First, we align with the strategic priorities of the system. Once you have that, you kind of know what consumers to go after, and then you need to learn what their perception and behaviors are and how to impact that. When you know that, you can basically say, what position do I want to take in their minds and hearts, which is the second bullet. Then you do the long-term brand building, about 50% of our spend. Some say it should be 60, others say it's 40. Our CFO says maybe 5, which is impossible because we have 10-year contracts with our sponsors. So I'm always at around 30 because Atlanta United and UGA are not cheap. But brand building is literally securing our long-term demand so that if and when people need healthcare, we come top of mind first. And Georgia has a lot of good alternatives. At the same time, the other 50% of our budget goes against brand activation. It's literally those people searching for healthcare. How do we convert them from consumers to patients? And that's literally the metric. It's conversion. And then the last one, if and when they choose us, you better make sure they have an experience that meets and exceeds their expectations. When you're sick, it's very different whether you're having a flu shot, or you're going to deliver a baby, or you have a stroke, or you have an open heart surgery. Everything gets different when you deal with healthcare. You're more anxious, more is at stake. You know, buying the wrong can of Pringles, you'll live. It's $1.25 at Kroger. Buying the wrong toilet paper, you'll get the right one next one. Healthcare is completely different. I'll give you one stat. Anybody knows what the average marriage in the United States is? It's 6 years. Don't get me started on that one. The average relationship with a doctor in the United States is 8 years. You could argue that the choice of your doctor is more important than the choice of your spouse. Anyway, I think my HR person told me 3 times to not use this example, but it's a fun fact. But choosing your healthcare is important. So therefore, brand orchestration is important, all the way from how you find a book and doctor online, how you check in before you walk and have all your information in MyChart, like most of us have a version of MyChart. 3 things happen when you do that. First and foremost, if the experience is the right one, you have happier and healthier patients, which is our purpose. You have to make a positive impact on every life we touch. The second thing is you have happier CFOs, because it's in the experience box where we make all of our revenue. That's when we send in your bill to the insurance company and get paid so that we can sustain our operations over the long term. And the third thing is very important. It feeds back data to the first bucket. We have more information on more patients more often, so we know better their perceptions and their behavior, so we can better build brand positioning, we can better build a brand, better do the activation, have a better experience, get more data, and the flywheel goes round and round and round. Now, you would say that the framework by itself is important, but actually the most important thing what we've done is not so much the framework, but the engine that's underneath it. We call it the insights engine that's fueled by data. That whole circle that I explained to you, at every single point, we have a lot of data points. We do a lot of analytics. We basically do everything that he recommended, maybe not everything. I don't think we do enough testing. And for sure, we do a lot what analytic partners recommended to do from the scenario planning. And you see some of the dashboards here, but literally this whole engine is driven by data, which was the breakthrough. The first conversations I had with the CEO and my team was not about, hey, what is the new brand and how do you assess the brand? That was the question, like, oh, do you think we have a strong brand? I said, well, I don't know. I don't have the data. It's kind of interesting to see that in a data-driven industry as healthcare, because everything we do in the clinical space and as medicine is science and data-driven, and then you flip it to like HR or your marketing, and there was way less data. And so it was a relatively easy sell. So what you do with patients, I'm going to treat the brand as a patient. And we're going to have all these diagnoses. Obviously, you need somebody needs to operate the engine. We call it the change capabilities, powered by talent. It's a range of our internal and external partners. And the one thing I would say here is when I worked at Procter, we embraced, this is from my friends at Character Camp, mostly the marketing metaphor of war. Procter is very about strategy and targeting and winning. When I switched to Georgia Pacific, it was mostly science. We had a lot of scientists. The owner of the company wrote a book, The Science of Success, very much about predictability. And in those companies, storytelling needed a lot of attention. So we hired better agencies. There's some of the folks at Cutwater in the room that we hired those at Georgia Pacific to improve our storytelling part. When I got to Piedmont, interesting enough, we actually had good agencies and a good in-house agency. We actually had a lot of strategists in marketing, but we had no scientists or little. So I created the whole department. I promoted folks, started hiring, because interesting enough, in a scientific organization, the marketing scientists were there. So that was another thing I would recommend you to do. Look at the mix of your talent, and are you hitting all of those 3 boxes? Obviously, you need to do it across the patient journey. For most of you, it's called the path to purchase or the consumer experience. We did that. That was a chart that had to be deleted. And then the last thing I would say, all of the data, or most of the data, helps you to look back, helps you to understand what you're doing this quarter and what you're going to do in this year. But what you also should be looking at, how can data help you? you know, the scenario planning that we talked about and some of the stuff that Shiv talked about, what's next, what's after next. I'll give you one example of what happened at Piedmont. This is what happened. This is what I reported to the board. We were in the lower quadrant, low favorability, which is our metric for brand preference or brand strength. At Procter, we call it equity. At Georgia Pacific, call it brand of the heart. And then from left to right on the horizontal axis, awareness. Literally is like how many people know us, how many people love us. And the more people know us and the more people love us, the more people will choose us if and when they need healthcare. So we move from the bottom left to the upper right. Fantastic, right? Well, not so much. This is when you look, we only serve Georgia. We have 14 regions in Georgia that we measure. And we literally says on the average and the aggregate we're doing well, but for each region we're not. Healthcare is local. You don't care about the quality of your hospital 40 miles down the road. You live in Atlanta, you want to know how people in Atlanta is doing. You don't care how people in Columbus is doing, or people in Athens, or people in Augusta. It's 3 hours, for goodness sake. So when we looked at this, it's like, oh, wow, we need to look in details. And this tells you in the upper right is our favorite. You know, we have strong awareness. They love us and they know us. So much so that our finance department is like, wait a minute, your map is overlapping with our financial performance. So now we're trying to combine those two, because can awareness and favorability be a predictor of profitability and revenue? We don't make profit. Revenue drivers. I cannot say competition. I cannot say market. I cannot say profit. And I think I did all three of them. Sorry, legal. But if you look at that, the bottom left is very bad to be. You know, they don't know us. They don't love us. But guess what? We just acquired them this year. That's literally Augusta and Macon and the cities that never heard of Piedmont before we got there in the last 12 months. So that needs to move up. The bottom right are pretty regions that have been there for a long term. And those 4 or 5 hospitals are dragging our performance down from a brand. So I'm going to do in-depth analysis. What is happening in those regions? One of the things is we acquired hospitals that had a very bad reputation to begin with. But after 5, 6 years, we have not been able to turn that around. And therefore, now my marketing approach, very much the data. We're already facing all the uncertainty that we showed, but we also have to start with our foundational positioning. That was it. So the 5 things I recommend is have that framework, power it, have an insights engine to power it, have the talent to operate it, do it across the path to purchase, and then make sure you look at what's happening today, tomorrow, and the day after tomorrow. All right. Any questions for any of us?
Question for you, Dow. You kind of answered it a bit. I mean, you spent almost 30 years selling Pringles and toilet paper, as you mentioned. You spent 30 years selling potato chips and toilet paper, where it was almost impossible for you to get first-party data, mostly in the CPG. And so now you go to Piedmont and you have a wealth of first-party data. So how did that sort of change the way you changed the way you handle marketing, and has it been as liberating as you could have imagined?
It was a little bit like a kid in a candy store, right? Yeah. So, oh wow, wait a minute, I don't have to backsteal and talk to Costco and Walmart to please share data, and then have like pay for the nose and have, sorry guys, I keep forgetting it's taping. Walmart and Costco are wonderful stores, but there is a reality that we are a retailer as much as we are a service provider, and we have the data. The interesting thing is that we did do some with it, but not enough. And the key was you have this ocean of information and data and where to begin. Then you have all of these restrictions. Keep in mind, we know more about consumers than consumers want anybody to know. We literally know, your blood results, your heart, your credit card, your insurance. Like there's so much we know, and it's so much protected. So you also have to be careful. I know I have 3.7 million patients. Therefore, I have 3.7 million accounts with their home address, with their insurance number, with their credit card number. But I don't have 3.7 million emails in my marketing database, because we still are asking people to opt in so I can send them the bill. No questions asked. They signed that away. But I still have to ask them separately, do you also want to get our wellness letter? I know everything, but still there's this huge wall, and say, okay, here I still need permission. So we're still doing the opt-in. But while that challenge is similar, on the flip end, you do know what's working and what's not working. I can literally see the office visits, which is basically store traffic for us. and appointments coming in, and then work it all the way back. But it's been a wonderful experience, but also a huge upside potential for us to address. One of the reasons I call it analytic partners to say, hey,
Thanks,
can
Dow.
help. No questions?
Hospitals that were not performing well from a favourability perspective. Was there other data that you had to see that the hospital may have had separately that showed the quality of patient outcomes, or did the marketing data then show up that maybe there was some, I'll use the word product, but patient experience or...
Yeah, so there's a lot of other data points, and obviously I know what's going on with each one of those hospitals. I just chose not to share it because Emory could be in the room, or Northside, or Wellstar. But interesting enough, brand position and service performance are not always go hand in hand. One of those hospitals had a very low favorability and an extremely high NPS score, which basically means that the patients that are in the hospital are extremely satisfied. Those that were not are not satisfied. So they would say, oh, I would never go there. But the people that went there said, well, you're a fool because they're fantastic. And then that is a marketer's dream, because that is a strong performing product or service that now need to be marketed better. There's also one of them that actually the quality perception, if you look at third-party evaluations like Press Ganey, there is an upside. It's like, if you go to a restaurant, you have 100A, and we have an 88C. That is a marketer's nightmare, because there's little I can do until you fix, whatever is not working. But having the in-depth analytics allowed us to go deeper and deeper to say, hey, what's going on? Why are people not choosing us, even though they know us? As you look at the chart, the frustrating thing is because we've been driving awareness through the roof last year. And there is a positive correlation for some of the hospitals. The higher the awareness, the higher the favorability, the higher the preference got. And we can literally see the conversion. Like, we literally got more patients. The other hospitals had a negative correlation. So literally stop marketing. Because the more people know us, the more they dislike us. They literally target each other like, oh, you saw that? Yeah, I would never go there. So we literally now have to say, and it's only one state, wow, how can it be so regional that in the city of Fayette or the city of, those are like small Georgia towns where, 50 miles, a 2-hour drive, there's a dramatic different perception. I never would thought of that. And, sitting here now, I would wonder, like some of the brands I had in the past that were national or global brands even, what the difference would have been there had we looked that in depth on the data. Maybe Pringles was much better in Kansas than it was in, Dayton, Ohio. I don't know. We never looked at it that close.
Thank you.
Maybe they do today at Kellogg's.
So with it seems like you built a great data platform there. The analytics are coming. You're using it. Is there an aspect of your current efforts, your marketing efforts, that still feel like a black box, that are tough to dig into, that's tough to extract information from still? And I know that it's not perfect. It's not, we're never going for perfection with data, but just if there's anything you're still, with your marketing efforts, challenged with.
I learned that the data folks do, and it's interesting that you said that, because I have that debate with my data leader, and he's like, oh, you can't present that to the board. I'm like, why not? Like, it's not perfect. Like, there's like, we don't know this. He's like, well, I'll tell them. And he's like, are you it's really, thank you for saying it's great. It's better than it was. It's nowhere near great. We're good trying to get to great. And yes, there's a lot of things that we are still trying to connect the dots. I'm not sure with you, both of you, but every time you open a door, it feels like there's 5 more doors that are behind that door. And every time you say, oh, I think we got this, and they're like, oh crap, there's actually more. Like this whole thing I just shared with you. Wow, we're making progress. And then we went deeper and deeper, like, well, we're making progress here, but we're doing the opposite here. And that's sometimes disheartening, because you want to declare success and say, hey, look at the value we've been driven. And they said, yeah, in those 5, not here, not here. And now we need to, it gets more complicated. And, as Shiv just said, data doesn't solve everything. I also oversee communication. One of the hardest things for me is to determine the value of internal communication and the value of PR. Because the biggest value of PR is avoid disaster stories. So, we kill big stories like, oh, so-and-so. It's hospitals, always something bad happens. You're the final station for a lot of folks. And, people are not happy with the outcome a lot of the times because grandma passed away or, the knee isn't working. And, so a lot of the PR is to make sure that all these negative stories go away. Well, how do you measure a non-event? So there's a lot of things that I don't think we'll ever know. Internal communication is the hardest. My leader knows how data-driven I am. Is like, well, what data you use for me? Like, she comes with like, okay, 100% of the employees go to our website. Yeah, great. They go like 10 times a year. Like, great. It's like, hopefully, because they need to do compliance training, they need to do benefit enrollment. I hope they do. And so it's very interesting to see what works and what doesn't work.
Thank you.
Question for Shiv. Just curious to know what kind of keeps you up at night work-wise when it comes to engagement and retention at Gannett.
Great question. So right now, as we know, given the macroeconomic trends, subscription is like one of the hardest businesses to be in. We all have read about Netflix. So consumers have choices. They have they have too much content available, and they only have 24 hours. Every customer only has 24 hours. And what keeps me up is trying to kind of maximize the value for our consumers, because I believe your marketing can be as great as you want it to be. Unless your product is really valuable, the consumers will not really pay attention. So trying to kind of provide that value, the most bang for their buck. So we are working with product, we are working with experience, we are working with content strategy, but that's what keeps me up at night. Do I have enough? If I'm a consumer, will I pay $9.99 or $14.99 for a print, about $30-$40 a month? Will I pay that? Am I going to do that? And if I would not do that, how can I expect my consumers to do that? Of course.
I had a question on how you've encouraged a culture of testing within your organization. I think every test carries some risk. So what have you done to encourage that and help the organization learn?
That's a great question. So I can give an example from one of my prior companies, Hilton. We were trying to kind of do the exact same thing. There were so many tests running in parts and pockets, and when it goes up to the C-level, they barely get to know anything. They hear stories. Oh, this department is telling me this is not working. However, this department tells me it's working. They do their own test. They have their own story there. So it was very fragmented. So what we did was we did a bottoms up and a top down. So we created an executive council. We call it steering committee for test and learn. We brought representatives from different departments, like the leaders from those departments, in that steering committee, and that met once in 2 months. Their objective was to review all the learning that came out of testing, and then they had an operating team. Operating team was the one that made sure that, okay, if I'm running a test, because what also happens in large organizations is, if I'm running a test, I have a test and control group, right? Control is not supposed to be touched, but some other department might be touching that control group. So my control is not truly a control, because I'm running this marketing promotion and I'm seeing, oh my God, my control is buying more than my test. What is happening? And then I call the salesperson. Oh yeah, we're running a promotion in that market. So operating committee made sure that does not happen. We are tied. We are flagging the data. We have data defined in the same way across all the departments. And then we had a working committee. So operating committee is still think of them as senior managers, directors. The working committee was the folks who are actually responsible for testing and learning. Now, you don't really have to have somebody whose title is test and learn. So let's say I'm the paid search person. Part of 20%, 30% of my job is test and learn. So we actually had those people leveraging the techniques, but we created a playbook. So like when it gets down to somebody like, who's 2-3 years in the business, they need to know what the standards are, what the protocols are. So we actually created a playbook for them. So if I'm a sales or a search specialist, like, I'll open the playbook. I'm like, okay, this is what I'm learning. This is what I'm measured. And this is where I record it. So we actually created a knowledge repository. So every single test was reposited there. And let's say 2 years down the line, somebody wants to kind of measure something. Sometimes test, like whatever the test results were, are a good starting point. I don't always agree with like looking at results from 10 years back because it's completely different. But that's what we did. Sorry for a long answer. Sure.
Hi, this question's from Maggie. I work at a really great B2B company and we have a wonderful marketing organization, so please take this neither here nor there. But how would you, in your experience working, with clients that are getting budget cuts and, heading into a recession and then literally not choosing to spend on impact that we'll see tomorrow or, short-term versus long-term, that's another story. How do you sell that in? How do you sell this like pause and then look at what's happening, compare yourself to your competitors, and then reinvest in what matters? Like, what is that pause moment and how do you actually win business there?
Yeah, well, that's where having data is extremely important. So I think what we do in working with the brands that we work with, and we work with B2B organizations that have had, particularly in the pandemic. So for example, events just being cut, right? That had a big impact. But it's all about, like I said, running different scenarios and bringing those different scenarios to finance or whoever is looking to cut those budgets, and basically showing them what that impact might be. So it's the pause is, let's take a step back. Let's look at the data. Let's run different scenarios. Let's look at different potential outcomes, and let's see what that's going to look like. And there needs to be cross-functional collaboration in that as well. So there's a change management component of bringing multiple parts of the organization together that have to be aligned, and that's also where testing can come into play. So ideally, it's not cutting budget, but for example, maybe there's a slight scale back, and then let's look at what that impact is, and then you can say, we only scaled back a small percentage, and look at that negative impact that it's having on our business to get those funds back. So there's different ways you can approach it, depending on the organizational dynamics and who those decision makers are.
That wraps things up. So I have a couple of people to thank. First off, thank you to the audience. Thank you for being here. Thanks for the terrific questions. Thanks to our partner, Analytics Partners.